There was one thing on that old Missouri mill that did not belong. Everything else was exactly what you would expect after years of nobody tending it. The paint had given up. The porch of the little mill house sagged toward the creek. Weeds had swallowed the drive so completely that I nearly missed the turn. The mill itself had stood beside Hollis Creek for more than 100 years, and it looked every day of it the wood gone soft and gray as driftwood, one corner of the roof dark where the water had found its way in. All of it was tired in the honest way that old things get tired, but the padlock on the mill door was brand new. I saw it the moment I came around the back of the house, bright steel catching the afternoon light, and I stopped walking. I had spent 37 years as a librarian and an archivist, and the first thing you learn in that work is that everything belongs to a system, and the second thing you learn is that the piece which does not fit the system is the piece that tells you the truth. That lock did not fit. Someone had come here and put it there on purpose. I was 68 years old. I had 44 years of marriage behind me, a husband 3 months in the ground, a rented car in the gravel, and almost nothing I could reach in the bank. My children had taken the house. They had taken the car. They had moved the savings into an account with my son's name on the paperwork and mine nowhere in sight. They had left me this mill because they believed it was worthless. They were wrong, and it took me a while to understand how wrong, but standing there in the weeds looking at that clean, bright lock, I already knew that Arnold had left me something, and that he had gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure I would be the one to find it. I should tell you how it began because the lock was the end of a long, quiet thing and not the start of it. I found Arnold on a Tuesday morning a little after 3. I had learned in a lifetime of libraries to wake in the dark and lie still and listen, and that morning the house was too still. The television was on in the front room, the sound turned low the way he liked it when he could not sleep. His coffee sat on the side table, still warm when I touched the cup. I went to him and I put 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist, the way I had done for my own mother at the end, and for a neighbor once, and for people I loved, and people I barely knew. Because a person who works with quiet enough for long enough learns the difference between a body that is resting and a body that is finished. There is a stillness that is only sleep, and there is another stillness underneath it, and once you have felt the second kind, you never mistake it again. I held his wrist, and I already knew, and I sat down beside him, and I did not call anyone for a long time. I wanted a little while where it was still just the 2 of us in the house before it became a thing that other people had to be told. The funeral was on a Thursday. More people came than I expected, and I stood at the door of the church and thanked every one of them, and my feet ached before the first hour was out, and I stood anyway because that is what you do. There were men Arnold had worked beside for 30 years, and neighbors from the street where we had lived for 26 of them, and a surprising number of people I did not recognize, who came up to me and said that Arnold had fixed their tractor at midnight in a hard winter, or gotten a stubborn engine running the week before harvest, and had never charged them what the work was worth. He fixed machines. That was what he did for a living, farm equipment and small engines, and he was good at it in a way that made people trust him with more than their machines. I thought that Thursday that I knew the whole shape of the man I had buried. I want to be honest about that because everything that came after depended on how sure I was and how wrong. Brent arrived 3 days later. He called it a family meeting, which should have told me something, because in my experience a family meeting was for deciding who hosted Thanksgiving, not for opening a folder. Brent was 43 that year, and he had been a lawyer for 15 of them, estate work mostly, which meant he spent his days helping other families arrange their deaths in an orderly fashion. He sat down across from me at the round oak table where Arnold and I had eaten breakfast for 31 years, where our grandchildren had done their homework, where Arnold used to spread out the newspaper long after there was any real reason to read a paper because he liked the feel of the pages under his hands. Brent set his folder on that table and opened it with the ease of a man who had done this many times. And my daughter Meredith came through the speakerphone from Denver, her voice careful, in a way it had been careful since the diagnosis, since the long treatment, since the Thursday at the church. "We just want everything handled properly, Mom," she said, and I noticed that she said it the way you say a thing you have rehearsed. Brent laid the first page down. The house. He had been added to the deed 11 years earlier after Arnold's first heart-trouble joint tenancy with right of survivorship. And he explained it to me the way you explain a thing to someone you have already decided cannot follow it. When one owner dies, the property passes to the other automatically. He said no. Probate, no waiting. "So the house is yours," I said, and he corrected me gently. It transfers to me. That is simply how the arrangement works. Dad set it up that way for a reason. The car was titled to Kaylin, my daughter-in-law, done a year and a half ago, because Arnold had wanted her to have something reliable to drive. The savings had gone into a trust 2 years back with Brent as the trustee for protection, he said. And when I asked protection from what he said probate creditors, the complications that come up when an estate is not structured properly. Dad was thorough, he told me. He wanted to be sure you were taken care of. I sat with my hands flat on the oak, and outside the kitchen window, the yard was going gold in the late afternoon, the flower beds I had planted every spring for 20 years, the white fence Arnold had painted the summer he retired. I understood each individual word my son said. It was the way the words fit together that I could not manage the architecture of them. The sense that a wall was being built, one reasonable sentence at a time, and that I was ending up on the outside of it. "Is there anything left?" I asked him. Brent turned to the last page, and something crossed his face that I would think about for a long time afterward. Not quite discomfort, more the small recalibration of a man reaching the part he has been saving. "There is a mill property," he said, Hollis Creek down in the Ozarks. Dad inherited it from an uncle years ago. He said it the way you read a footnote out loud. The county has been sending notices back taxes around $9,000, and the assessed value is less than what is owed on it. He let a pause do some work. "It is not really worth pursuing," he said. I looked at him and I said, "I will take it." Brent glanced up. "Sorry," he said. "The mill," I said. "I will take that." Mom Meredith said from the speaker, "There is nothing down there. It has not been lived in for years." "You said it belongs to me," I said. "So I will take it." And here is the thing I want you to notice, because I noticed it right then, and I have never stopped noticing it. Neither of them argued. They had taken the house I had lived in for 26 years, the car I drove to the grocery store, the savings Arnold and I had built, one careful deposit at a time across 4 decades. And when I asked to keep a ruined mill that carried a debt bigger than its worth, they let me have it without a single word. A person will fight you over anything they think has value. The silence told me exactly what my children believed that mill was worth. Before Brent left, he stopped in the doorway and looked back at me with something that was almost warmth. "Dad wanted me to take care of you," he said. That was what he wanted most. And I looked at my son standing in the doorframe, his jaw and his shoulders, and the particular way he filled a doorway. All of it. Arnold's exactly. And I thought about the coffee still warm on the side table, and I believed him. I want to be truthful about that too. I was tired, and grief makes you tired in a way that sleep does not fix, and I let myself believe my son, because believing him was easier than the alternative, and because I had spent my whole life among people who could be trusted, and I did not yet know that this was the very thing Arnold had been afraid of. I stood at the kitchen window after Brent's car pulled away, and I looked at the yard, and I did not cry. I thought I will be fine. That was the mistake I would spend the next several months paying for. I want to be clear about the money, because people hear that a woman was left with nothing, and they picture a purse turned out on a table, and it was not quite that. I had my Social Security, and I had a small pension from the library system, and those would come the way they always came. But everything that Arnold and I had built together, the savings that were meant to be, the soft landing at the end of a long working life, was inside a trust that my son controlled, and the house I had slept in for 26 years belonged to him now under the survivorship, which meant that in the plainest terms, he could ask me to leave it, and I would have to go. What I could reach with my own 2 hands that month came to almost nothing. So when I decided to drive down to Missouri and see the one thing that was truly and only mine, I rented the cheapest car at the lot in Edwardsville, and I counted my money before I went the way I used to count the day's returns at the circulation desk, not out of fear, but out of the habit of knowing exactly where I stood. The drive was close to 4 hours. Illinois flattened out, and then the land began to fold, and I crossed the river into Missouri and watched the country change from farm to hill, the road climbing and dropping through the Ozarks, with the creeks running full beside it. I kept both hands on the wheel the way Arnold had always told me to, and I did not spend the miles on feeling. Feeling is not useful at 70 miles an hour. The car is gone. I told myself the way I would have written a fact on a catalog card. This is true. What comes next? I got off the county road where the mailbox said Hollis Creek in letters half-eaten by rust, and I turned up a gravel drive so overgrown I could hear the weeds dragging along both sides of the rental, and I came out at the end in front of a 2-story wood house that had been white once and was gray, now fading, the way some people fade near the end, not dramatically, just surrendering a little more each season. The porch held. The windows were whole. I got out and stood in the gravel, and the wind moved through some gap in the roof timbers with a low sound almost like breathing, and I pulled my jacket closed, and I walked toward the house and then past it because something behind the house was asking to be looked at first. It was the mill, and behind the mill the old wheelhouse, and the mill had stood 100 years and looked every year of it. The siding had weathered to that soft gray-brown of wood left long in the weather. The roof sagged at the south end. One wall carried a long diagonal crack that had been there so many years it had become part of how the building stood rather than a thing wrong with it. And on the main door on a hasp so new the screws still had bright edges, hung a padlock that had never seen a winter. I walked up close and I put my hand flat against the old planks the way I used to lay my hand along a shelf of records at the end of a shift, not looking for anything in particular, just taking the inventory that a place gives you if you are quiet enough to receive it. The wood was dry and firm. Whatever was inside had been kept dry on purpose. I was on my second slow pass around the building when a man came through a gap in the fence line, as if he had done it 1,000 times, and he had carrying 2 folding chairs under one arm and a thermos in his free hand. He was near my own age, maybe a little past it, broad through the shoulders, moving with the settled, deliberate ease of a man who had worked outdoors every day of his life. He set both chairs down in the gravel without asking whether I wanted them, and he poured coffee into the cap of the thermos and held it out to me. "You must be Elaine," he said. "Arnold talked about you." I took the coffee. The cap was warm in both my hands, and the coffee smelled of something dark underneath it, chicory, maybe the way my grandmother used to make it. "Silas Rourke," he said, "next place over, going on 20 years. He sat in the second chair and looked at the mill, the way you look at a thing you have looked at 10,000 times, not studying it, just resting his eyes there. "Arnold said you would come," he told me. A pause. "He said you would look at that lock first." I did not ask him how he knew my name. I had spent 37 years in a profession where the important thing arrives sideways, offered a little at a time by people who are waiting to see whether you are ready to receive it, and I recognized the posture of a man who had been asked to hold something and was choosing his moment. So I sat down in the other chair, and I drank the coffee, and I asked him when Arnold had changed the lock. 3 weeks before he passed, Silas said. I watched him from my kitchen window. He drove down alone, did not tell me he was coming, and I saw his truck in the drive and went over to say hello, and he was here at the door with a drill and new hardware working slow because he was not moving well by then. I asked, did he need a hand? He said he had it. And I asked, did he say why? Not exactly, Silas said, and he turned the thermos slowly in his hands. He said if anyone came asking about this mill before you showed up, I was to tell them it was empty. Nothing here worth seeing. But when you came, he said I was to tell you to go on in. The wind came through the roof timbers again, and somewhere in the tangled yard a bird called twice and stopped, and I looked down into the coffee and understood that somebody had been paying attention, and had been paying attention for a good deal longer than I knew. There was one more thing, Silas said, and he said it the way people say the thing that matters after the easy things are out of the way. He said you would know what to do with it, whatever is in there. He said you would know better than anyone alive. And I sat with that a while. 44 years of marriage, 37 years of quiet, careful work, a rented car in the drive and a debt down in the courthouse records, and a mill that no one had thought worth pursuing. And my husband at the very end of his strength had still believed in me enough to build a door and leave me the key and trust that I would walk through it. He just had not been able to say any of it to my face. I finished the coffee and Silas took the cap back without making anything of it, and then he reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and held out a small brass key on a plain ring. He left it with me, Silas said. Told me to keep it until you came. I took it. The metal was cool and worn smooth at the bow, worn the particular way a thing gets worn when it has been carried and handled for a long time. And I closed my fingers around it, and knew that Arnold had carried this, had held it exactly as I was holding it now on some afternoon, 3 weeks before the end, when he drove 4 hours by himself to do the one thing he had left the strength to do. I did not open the mill that evening. I want to tell you why, because it matters to the kind of woman I am. It was going toward dark, and I had learned across a long life that the things which are going to change you should not be met when you are tired and the light is failing and there is no one to sit with the weight of it. I slept that night in Arnold's uncle's old room in the mill house on a mattress that smelled of cedar and long disuse under a quilt I found folded in the closet, and I lay awake most of it listening to the old house speak its language of settling timber and wind, finding every gap. Sometime before dawn, I gave up on sleep and simply waited for the light, the way I had waited for so many things across the years, results and diagnoses and the slow answers that only come when you stop demanding them. When the sky finally grayed, I got up and made coffee on the millhouse stove and carried the brass key out across the wet grass to the mill. The lock opened on the first try. The door swung outward on its hinges, heavy and slow, the movement of something solid and well kept, and I pulled it the full width and stepped back, and the morning light fell into the mill in a long, clean rectangle and caught the dust rising off the threshold. There was no machinery, no sacks of grain, no rusted gears, no feed bags or fence posts, none of the things a working mill collects across 100 years. Instead, there were wooden shelves along all 3 inner walls, floor to ceiling, built with the careful precision of a man who expected them to bear weight for a very long time. And on every shelf, arranged in an order I could not yet read, there were shapes wrapped in white cloth, dozens of them, more than dozens. I walked in slowly. My shoes were quiet on a concrete floor that had been poured smooth and level in a building where the original floor should have been dirt or worn plank, and I noted that the way I noted everything, filing it away another piece that did not fit the system, and therefore told the truth. The air inside was cool and dry, controlled not the damp decay I had braced for. I reached for the nearest bundle, the one closest to the door, the one the light was already touching, and I lifted the cloth away. It was a violin. The wood glowed under the cloth, a deep-figured maple on the back and sides, and a close-grained spruce across the front, the varnish worked up in layers to a color like dark honey. And I turned it in the light, and it was beautiful in a way that stopped my breath, not the beauty of a factory, but the beauty of a thing made slowly by a hand that had made many. I looked in through one of the F-holes, and there was a paper label glued inside the ink, faded but clear, and it carried a name and a year. In a hand I had been reading on grocery lists and birthday cards for 44 years. Arnold Kingswell, the man who fixed tractors and drove the same truck for 16 years and fell asleep in the second half of every movie we ever watched, who told the same 3 jokes at every family dinner and laughed at them every time as though he had never heard them before. I turned the violin over, and on the back, in his slightly right-leaning script, there was a small note. Low-bout figure worked the varnish too thin along the edge, would do it warmer next time. I had been 31 that year, the year on that label. We had 2 small children and a mortgage and a car that did not like the cold, and not enough money most months. And I remembered the particular exhaustion of that stretch of our life, and the particular love inside the exhaustion, and I stood in the doorway of a building I had owned for less than a day, and understood that for all of it, all of those years my husband had been down here making this, and I had not known. Not once. Not in 44 years. I held the violin in both hands, and I did not put it down for a long time, and behind me the light kept climbing into the mill and touching one white bundle after another, dozens of them, waiting on their careful shelves for exactly this morning and exactly this woman to come and lift the cloth. I started the inventory the way I had started every workday of my life, at the left end of the first wall, moving right, nothing skipped and nothing rushed. I had brought a small spiral notebook from my purse, the kind I had filled 100 of across 37 years, and I wrote down each instrument as I came to it, the year from the label, the kind of instrument whatever Arnold had written on the back. I worked through the whole of that first morning, and did not stop. Silas brought coffee at 9 and set it on the workbench without a word and went away again, and I drank it cold an hour later and kept going. By the middle of the second day I had counted 163, and then I stopped counting because the number had stopped being the point. Most of them were violins and fiddles, which I learned are the same instrument wearing 2 names depending on the music you ask of it. There were mandolins with their bright doubled strings, and there were larger shapes. I came to understand were violas, and along the back wall in a row by themselves, a handful of cellos, tall and grave and beautiful. Some were made of a dark-figured walnut, and some of a maple, whose grain ran in tight rippled waves that caught the light and moved when you tilted them. And I began to see as I worked that Arnold had gone back to the same woods and the same shapes across decades, the way a man returns to a place he loves, that he had been having one long conversation with a handful of ideas, refining the same few things patiently for 40 years. The notes on the backs told the story if you read enough of them in order. Tried the longer body too dark and the low strings went back to the old pattern. Third time working this figure of maple, finally understood it. The graph of a life spent paying attention one instrument at a time. There were some that stopped me longer than the others. There was a small violin, a child's size no bigger than my forearm, and the label inside it carried the year our daughter Meredith was born. And I sat down on the concrete floor and held it in my lap for a while, because I could not remember Arnold ever giving Meredith a violin, and I understood that he had made it, and then not been able to give it the same way he had made all of this, and not been able to show it. There was a fiddle whose label named the year we buried my mother, and I did not need the note on the back to know what he had been doing in the mill that autumn. And there were instruments that carried only a date, and nothing else days that must have meant something to him alone, and I would never know what, and that was its own particular grief. It is not the grief of losing a person. It is the grief of standing inside the full size of a life you thought you had already measured, and finding that it went on for rooms and rooms past the door you had always stopped at. Silas came back in the early afternoon of the second day with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and he sat down beside me on the floor with his back against the shelving, the way two people sit when there is no hurry and nothing to perform, and we ate for a while without talking. Then he said there was a man came here once about 11 years back. I set my sandwich down. Dark blue car, he said, an expensive one, pulled up to the gate on a Tuesday morning. I remember it was a Tuesday because I was mending the fence on that side and I saw him come. Arnold went out to meet him, and the two of them stood at the gate a long time, 40 minutes more. And the whole while, Arnold had his arms crossed. Silas looked at the crack in the mill wall as he said it. That was not like him, he said. Your husband was the easiest man in the world to stand next to. I never once saw him cross his arms at a person until that morning. The man drove off. Silas went on, and Arnold came into the mill and shut the door, and I did not see him again until after dark. And the next morning he came to my place first thing before I had finished my coffee, and he said, Silas, if anyone ever comes to this property asking about the mill, anyone at all except Elaine, I want you to tell them it is empty. Nothing here worth seeing, and then I want you to call me. Silas turned the wax paper over in his hands. I asked him who the fellow was, he said. Arnold would not say, but he kept a photograph on the windowsill in the mill house, a family Christmas. And some time later, I was in there, and I looked at it, and I knew the face. It was your son. I sat very still. 11 years ago, Brent had driven down here in the blue car, had stood at the gate while his father crossed his arms and said whatever a father says in that situation. And the next morning, Arnold had gone to a neighbor, before the coffee was cold, and begun quietly to build a wall. He had known. He had known for 11 years, and he had prepared for 11 years, and he had never said one word of it to me. I understood it sitting there on the cold floor. I understood the logic of it, and the fear underneath the logic. Arnold was a man who handled things alone, who fixed what was broken without announcing that it had been broken, who asked for help only at the very last edge of needing it, and often not even then. He had built these shelves by himself. He had driven down alone to change the lock. He had trusted a fence-line neighbor with instructions he would not trust his own son to honor, and he had done all of it rather than come home and say to me, Elaine, I am afraid of what our boy might do. I held that for a moment without judging it, because judging it would have been easy and would have taught me nothing. Then I got up and walked to the far corner of the mill, because there was something there I had noticed on my very first pass, and set aside the way you set aside the symptom you are not yet ready to think about. One of the foundation stones in that corner sat a little proud of the others, and the shelf in front of it had been built standing off the wall by a few inches, instead of flush against it, just enough room for a hand to reach behind and down. I had noted it, and moved on because I had been counting, and because I had not yet been ready for whatever else the mill might be keeping. Now I was ready. I worked the shelf forward on its base, and it rolled because Arnold had set casters under it. Another small kindness left for a person he knew would come, and I crouched and got my fingers around the proud stone and lifted it, and it came up clean out of a bed that had been cut to hold it. Underneath, in a hollow lined with a scrap of old blanket, sat a gray metal box, the fireproof kind they sell at any hardware store in the country, for keeping papers safe from the ordinary disasters of a house. It was not locked. It had a simple latch, and I lifted the latch and opened the lid. Inside there was a sealed envelope with my name on the front in Arnold's handwriting, that slightly right-leaning script I had been reading for 44 years. There was a folded document beneath it that I did not open yet, and there was a business card bent a little at one corner from lying at the bottom of the box, and the card read, Nora Whitfield, Attorney at Law, and a town I knew was less than an hour from the mill. On the back of the card in Arnold's hand, 4 words. She has been waiting. Call. I sat back on my heels with the card in both hands, and I looked at it for a long time. He had known the danger was coming, and he had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything methodically without announcement, trusting that the right person would find the right door at the right time. He had simply run out of time to explain any of it to my face. So he had put the key in my hand instead, and left the card in the box, and trusted the rest to a stubborn woman and a patient stranger. I made the call from the workbench, standing where the light came through the one clean window. It rang twice, and a woman answered, and before I had finished saying my own name, she said, "Mrs. Kingswell, I have been waiting to hear from you." Her voice was calm and unhurried, the voice of a person who had decided some time ago not to be surprised by this call whenever it finally came. How long, I asked her, because it seemed the only thing worth asking first. 11 years, she said. Your husband first came to me 11 years ago. His instructions were that I was to keep records to document and value what he was building down at the mill as the years went on, and to hold everything ready, and that I was not to contact you or anyone else unless there was an immediate legal threat to the property. I was to wait until you came to me on your own. I set the card down on the workbench. 11 years. Arnold had been paying a stranger to keep watch over his life's work for 11 years. Through the first heart trouble, and the diagnosis, and the long treatment, and everything that came after, and he had never once let it show on our own kitchen table. I need to understand the will, I told her. My son brought a will? Yes, Nora said, and her voice went careful in the particular way that told me she had thought about how she would say this. Let me tell you first the thing that matters most, Mrs. Kingswell, because I do not want you to carry the worry any longer than you have to. The mill at Hollis Creek does not pass through any will. Neither do the instruments. Your husband came back to me a little over 2 years ago, and we created a revocable living trust, and he placed the mill and everything inside it into that trust while he was alive. You are the sole beneficiary of it. I am the successor trustee, which means that on his death, my only job was to see that everything in the trust came to you cleanly outside of probate, and it has. There is no will anywhere that can reach it. Whatever document your son is holding, it has no power over a single board of that mill or a single instrument on those shelves. They were yours the moment your husband died, and there is nothing anyone can do to change that, and no courtroom anyone can take you into to try. I stood there and let it settle. I had spent my career learning the difference between the words a person says and the structure underneath the words, and I heard the structure of what she was telling me, and it was sound. But I said, there was a but, because I could feel one waiting. Yes, Nora said gently, there is a but, and it is not about the mill. Your husband told me when we made the trust that he had signed another document he was not proud of some months before he came to me. He did not tell me the full story that day. He wrote it down instead. He wrote you a letter here in my office the same afternoon we executed the trust, and I have been holding it for a little over 2 years. A pause. I think you should read it here with me nearby rather than alone at the mill. Some things are better received in a room where someone can bring you a glass of water. Can you come to me tomorrow? I looked at the folded document still lying in the metal box, the one I had not opened, and I understood now what it must be the will Kalin had brought, the one Arnold had kept as evidence against himself, or as penance, I would not know which until I read the letter. I will come in the morning, I said. Nora Whitfield's office was 2 flights up in a narrow brick building a block off the town square, small and organized with the particular neatness of a person who understands that in her line of work the details are the whole of the difference between one outcome and another. She was younger than I had expected, 40 or a little past it, with the steady manner of someone who had delivered hard news before and had learned that the way you deliver it matters as much as the news. She put a sealed envelope on the desk in front of me, my name on the front in Arnold's hand, and she said I will be just outside. Take all the time you need. And she closed the door and left me alone with it. The envelope was sealed with tape rather than glue because Arnold never trusted glue. He said it dried out and failed you exactly when you needed it to hold. I turned it over once and set it flat and looked at my name in his handwriting for a while before I opened it. Inside were 7 pages handwritten in blue ballpoint, the same cheap brand I had once given him a box of a dozen as a joke because he was forever losing them, and he had laughed and kept everyone. The early pages were in his usual hand, steady and square. I could see without having reached them yet that the later pages were written smaller and tighter, the hand of a man whose strength was going but whose intention was not. I began to read. Elaine, he had written. I am writing this at Nora's desk because my hand is steadier here than at home these days, and I want you to be able to read it. I have already been here 2 hours, and I am only on the second page, which should tell you how hard this is to put down. I will start with the instruments because that part is the simplest. I began before I met you. A friend in college built a guitar and let me help, and I found I had a feel for it that surprised me more than it surprised anyone else. When you and I came together, I did not tell you, not out of any decision. I just did not know how to introduce it. It belonged to a younger version of me, and I did not know whether that version fit inside the life we were building, and so I said nothing. And then the years went by, and the longer I had not said it, the harder it became to say. By the time the children were small, I had a room full of work I had never shown a soul, and showing it would have meant confessing a secret I had already kept past the point where there was any easy way to explain it. So I kept it a little longer, and it became 40 years. I drove down to the mill most months. I told you I was going fishing. You packed me a lunch every time, and you never once questioned it, and that was a kindness I did not deserve, and never thanked you for the way I should have. I want you to know I was careful in a way that shames me now. I kept a change of clothes at the mill, and I washed there before I drove home so I would not carry the smell of varnish and cut wood into our house. I planned my own lie down to the last detail month after month, year after year. I told myself I was protecting something fragile. I understand now that a thing you have to hide that carefully from the person you love is not fragile. It is just hidden. I am sorry for the size of it, Elaine. 40 years is a long time to keep a room shut. The hand grew smaller on the 4th page. Now the harder part he had written. Brent came to the mill 11 years ago. I had been speaking with a gallery in the city, not to sell anything, only to understand what the work might be worth so that I would know what I was leaving behind. Someone there mentioned it to someone they should not have, and it found its way to our son. He drove down on a Tuesday unannounced, and he did not ask me about the instruments. He asked about the land, the assessed value, the tax situation, what my plans were for the property. He was careful and thorough, and I understood exactly what he was doing, because I know him because he is mine. And I raised him, and I have watched him look at other people's estates that same way for a living. I did not tell you, because I did not want to make you choose between your son and your husband, and because I believed I could handle it quietly the way I handle everything. I was wrong to carry it alone. I see that now. What I did not prepare for was Kaylin. In November, a little over 2 years ago now in the stretch, you will remember as the worst of the treatment, when I could barely get up the stairs. She came to the house one afternoon while you were out. Brent did not know she was coming. She had a document with her, a will she had drawn up herself, and she told me that if I did not sign it, she would tell Brent everything about the mill and what was in it, and that Brent would find a way to take the property before I died. She had watched this family long enough to know precisely what I was most afraid of, and she set it on the table in front of me and waited. And I was tired, Elaine, in a way that had gone past tired into something I do not have a word for. And I was frightened, and I was alone in the house on an afternoon when I should not have been alone, and I signed it. That is the thing I am most ashamed of in my whole life. Not the secret about the instruments, I can at least explain that, even if the explanation is not good enough. This I cannot explain. I had spent 40 years protecting something, and in one afternoon I handed it toward the very people I had been protecting it from, because I did not have the strength that day to say no. 3 months later, when I had a little strength back, I came to Nora, and we made the trust the real one. The one that says what I actually want, which is that all of it goes to you, and only you. I put the mill and every instrument into it while I was still clearly myself, and Nora's people watched me sign it, and it cannot be undone by anything Kaylin made me put my name to, because a trust like this stands above a will and outside of it. The paper she frightened me into signing is worth nothing now. I kept it in the box so that you would know I did not hide the worst of it from you, only from the world. I did not tell you any of this while I was alive, because I believed the structure would hold. I believed you would find the mill and find Nora, and that everything would already be in order before it ever became something you had to fight. I thought I could fix it so completely that you would never have to know how close I came to losing it for you. I was protecting you the wrong way again, the only way I ever really learned by keeping the hard thing to myself. I understand now that leaving you to find all of this alone was not protection. But I ran out of time to do it any better, and this letter is the best I have left. I set the pages down on Nora's desk, and I sat for a long while without moving. Outside the window, the town went about its ordinary morning, a delivery truck, someone laughing on the sidewalk below, all of it indifferent to the fact that on the second floor of a brick building, a woman was reading the truest and most frightened words her husband had ever written her. He had been afraid. He had been alone in our own house on the worst afternoon of the worst month, and he had signed, and then he had spent the last of his strength quietly making it right, and he had died believing he had spared me the knowledge of any of it. I picked the pages back up because there was one I had not reached a final page in that smaller, tighter hand, and I read the top line of it, and it said, "You will find this. I know you will because you are the most stubborn person I have ever loved. And I mean that as the highest thing I know how to say." And below that he had written that there was one more thing at the mill in the far corner behind the last shelf on the creek side that he had made and not finished, and that he wanted me to go and see it before I decided anything about what came next. I folded the letter along its creases and held it in both hands, and then I knocked on the door to tell Nora I was ready, and I drove back toward Hollis Creek to find the one thing my husband had left unfinished. The far corner behind the last shelf on the creek side was the one part of the mill I had walked past twice without stopping because the light did not reach it, and because I had told myself I would come to it when I had come to everything else. Now I went straight to it. There was a work stand back there, and on the stand held in a padded cradle Arnold had built to fit it, exactly stood a cello that was not finished. The body was complete, the same dark-figured walnut he had returned to across all those years. The front carved and graduated, and joined the scroll cut and curled at the top of a neck that had been shaped and smoothed. But there was no varnish on it yet, only the bare wood sanded to the softness of skin, and there were no strings, and the pegs sat loose in their holes unfitted. It was a whole instrument caught one step short of being able to make a sound. I looked inside through the F-hole, and there was a label, and unlike every other label in that mill, it did not carry only a name and a year. It read for Elaine. And under that, in the small tight hand of the last months, the first one I ever made for you to keep, and the only one I ever made that I meant to play myself. I stood there, and I understood the whole shape of it at once, the way you sometimes understand a person only after they are gone and can no longer be asked. For 44 years, my husband had made instruments for other people to play. Strangers would draw a bow across the work of his hands and never know whose hands, and he had wanted it that way, or had at least allowed it. And the single instrument he had made for me, the one he meant to finish and learn to play so that he could sit in our own front room some evening and give me back in sound everything he had never found the words for, that was the one he ran out of time to complete. He had spent his life saying, "Look at what I see when I look at the world," and he had said it in walnut and maple, and never once out loud, and the sentence he had been trying his whole life to finish. The one that began, "Look at what I see when I look at you," was standing in the corner of a mill in the Ozarks, with no varnish and no strings, and it would stay unfinished now because the only person who could finish it was 3 months in the ground. I did not cry then either. I put my hand flat on the bare wood, the way I had put 2 fingers to his wrist that last morning, and I felt the shape he had left me, and I stood with it a long time. Brent came 4 days later, and he came without calling ahead, which told me more than anything he could have said, because a man who telephones first is managing a situation, and a man who simply appears has lost his grip on one. I saw the car from the Millhouse kitchen window, the dark blue car, the same one Silas had described from 11 years back, coming up the ruined drive slower than the road required the way you drive, when you are looking at something you expected to find different than it is. It parked beside my rental, and my son sat in it a moment with his hand still on the door. I watched him take the place in. The mill house with its windows washed and a thread of smoke from the kitchen chimney. The mill behind it with the door shut and the new lock plain even at that distance. The drive I had spent a morning clearing. He looked at all of it with the careful attention of a man doing arithmetic, and then he came to the door and knocked, and I opened it and did not smile, and did not step back to let him in. I stood in the doorway and looked at my son, his jaw and his shoulders. Arnold's exactly the copy that had gotten the outside right, and something on the inside badly wrong. "Mom," he said, and his voice was calibrated, the concerned son, the reasonable man entirely in control. "I have been worried. You have not been answering." "I have been busy," I said, and I stepped back. Then, not in welcome, but because what I had to say was better said sitting down. "Come in." I made coffee the way I had made it for 31 years in another kitchen, the same order, the same motions, because it gave my hands something to do, and because it told him nothing had changed in me while everything had. I set 2 mugs on the table and sat down across from him, and he looked at me the way he had looked at the property from his car, assessing, and I let him look. Then I placed 3 things on the table between us. The trust document Nora had prepared with her cover letter clipped to the front. The appraisal of the instruments, the one Arnold had paid her to build across 11 years. And on top, so that he would see it first, the will Kaylin had frightened his father into signing, the one I had taken from the metal box. I watched his face as he understood what he was looking at. It did not collapse. He was far too controlled for that, too practiced. But his right hand resting flat on the oak pressed down against the wood, and I have spent my life reading the small movements people cannot help, and I read that one. "Where did you get this?" he said, and I noticed that he did not say, "What is this?" because he knew exactly what it was, all 3 of it. He knew the trust the moment he saw the shape of it, and he knew what it meant. "From Nora Whitfield," I said. "The attorney your father kept for 11 years since the Tuesday you drove down here in that car and stood at the gate and asked him about the land." His face did not move, but something behind it did. "We can discuss the legal situation," he said carefully. "We can—" I agreed. "But first, I am going to tell you something, and you are going to sit there and hear all of it, because you have made me hear a great many things at kitchen tables lately, and now it is my turn." I told him about Kaylin. I told it the way I had told families the hard thing across 37 years, plainly and completely, and in the order it happened, my voice level and my eyes on his face the whole time. The November afternoon. His father alone in the house at the worst of the treatment, barely able to climb the stairs. Kaylin coming while I was out. The document she brought and the threat she made that she would tell Brent everything and that Brent would find a way to take the mill before Arnold died. The signature of a tired and frightened man who did not have the strength that day to say no. I watched Brent the entire time because I had spent my whole life learning that you do not get to skip the diagnosis just because it hurts the person receiving it. And here is what I saw. His composure did not break the way a guilty man's breaks when he is caught. It broke the way a wall shows water from the inside, slowly the surface changing before the structure does. His jaw tightened. His eyes went to a point on the table just past the papers, unfocused the look of a man running a sequence of events and arriving somewhere he had not expected to arrive. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet, and his hand was still flat on the oak, and he had not touched his coffee. She did not tell me he said. "Not that is not true. Not you are mistaken. Not any of the things a man says when he knew and is choosing to deny it. Just she did not tell me in the voice of a person stating a fact he is still in the middle of believing." And I looked at him, and I understood that it was true. He had not known. I could see it the way you can see a fever break. He had spent years mapping his father's estate, calculating what could be moved, and how letting me leave the only home I had known with a rented car and a trust I could not touch. And none of that was undone by the fact that his wife had gone somewhere he had not sent her. I did not forgive him for what he had done. But I was an archivist. I spent my life refusing to throw away the true thing just because it was inconvenient to the story I already had. And the true thing here was that my son had not known about the coercion, and I recorded it exactly as it was, no larger and no smaller. He had done a great deal that was wrong. He had not done this particular one. Both things were true, and I let them both stand. He looked up from the table after a while. Something in his face had reorganized, not softened exactly, but shifted the way a room looks different after you move one piece of furniture and finally understand why it always felt wrong. "What are you going to do?" he asked. And I want you to notice that it was the question of a man who already understood there was nothing he could do because there was not, and he was enough of a lawyer to have seen it the moment he read the trust. He could not touch the mill. He could not touch the instruments. And the only way to attack the trust would have been to drag the whole story of Kaylin's November afternoon into the light, the very thing that had made his father build the trust in the first place, which meant that fighting me would cost him everything and win him nothing. He had come all this way to find out whether I knew, and now he knew that I knew, and there was no move left on the board. "I am going to do what your father asked me to do," I said. "I am going to bring these instruments into the light where people can hear them. That is all. There is nothing here for you to sign, and nothing for you to manage." I poured him a glass of water and set it in front of him, and he did not drink it, and after a while he stood up and left, and I watched the blue car go back down the drive. And I did not feel triumph, only a kind of tiredness that had somewhere clean to rest at last. Meredith called that night at 9:30, which meant she had been sitting with the phone in her hand for hours before she could make herself do it. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. I had not drunk, the papers still in front of me, and I saw her name come up on the screen and I answered. "Mom," she said, and her voice broke on the single word, not dramatically, just the small, honest fracture of a person who has been holding something a long time and has finally set it down. I said nothing. I waited. It was not coldness. It was the same thing I had done at 100 bedsides, the deliberate, respectful silence that says, I am here, and I am listening, and I will not fill this space until you are ready to fill it yourself. She cried for a moment, and then she began to talk. She had heard Brent mention the mill years ago, a phone call she had not been meant to overhear, something about their father having property in Missouri, about handling it before anything happened. She had understood what she was hearing, and she had told herself that she did not know the details, that not knowing the details was the same as not being part of it, that a person who stays out of the room cannot be blamed for what happens in the room. It was not the same thing I said. A silence. No, she said. It was not. I got up from the table and went to the window, and outside the yard was dark, past the reach of the porch light, and the mill was a shape in the dark, solid and present, and full of everything that still had to happen. "Do you know what your silence cost me?" I asked her. "Yes," she said, small. "I do not think you do." I said, "Not fully." And I kept my voice level, the voice I used when the truth needed to be heard clearly, and any softening would only get in its way. "It was not your brother taking the house that hurt the most," I told her. "It was not the car or the savings. Those are things, and some of them come back in time. It was reading your father's letter in a lawyer's office an hour from here, with no one in the world beside me. Sitting in that room and learning everything he had carried and everything he had been afraid of and everything he tried to fix before he ran out of time alone, with a stranger's secretary bringing me a glass of water because she could see I needed something and there was no one else there to hand it to me. That is what I cannot undo quickly, Meredith. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," she said. Not a defense, not a qualification, just the word and the weight of it. We stayed on the line a moment in silence. A mother and a daughter, 1,000 miles apart, sitting together with the exact shape of what had been done and what it had cost. Then Meredith said, "Can I come?" And I looked at the dark shape of the mill and its 163 instruments and its one unfinished cello, 44 years of a man's quiet attention waiting behind a door. I had opened alone. "You can come," I said, "but not to feel better about yourself. That is not what this is." "Then what is it?" she asked. "Your father made 163 instruments over 40 years, I said, and not one living person ever heard a single one of them. I am going to change that, and it is going to be a great deal of work, cataloging and research and telephone calls and driving, and I need real help, not company. That is what coming here means. Do you understand?" There was a silence then, different from the silences earlier, not the silence of a person deciding what to say, but the silence of a person deciding who she was going to be. "Yes," she said, "I understand. Come Saturday," I told her. "Bring clothes you can work in." I hung up and stood at the window a long time, and then I did something I had not done since the morning I found him. I slept quickly and all the way through in the mill house that was mine on the property, that was mine with the work of my husband's hands, safe on their shelves 100 feet away. It took the better part of that autumn and the winter after it. Meredith came and she stayed and she worked, and slowly the thing between us began to knit, not into forgiveness. That word is too clean for what it was, but into something built and earned the way you rebuild anything, one honest board at a time. Nora helped us understand what the instruments were and what they were worth, and more important, what they could be. And Silas was there through all of it, arriving at 7 in the morning, without announcement, driving us where we needed to go, lifting what needed lifting, saying little, and meaning all of it. It was Silas in the end who gave the whole thing its name. I had been trying to think what to call it, sitting at the millhouse table turning through my notebook, and I remembered what he had said to me on that first afternoon in the gravel before I understood any of it. Arnold was always working at something quiet, he had said. That was it. That had always been it. And so we called it the quiet work. We chose a small hall in the town near the mill, a plain room with good light and a wooden floor, and we had a handful of the instruments strung and set right by people Nora knew who understood such things, and we asked a few local players to come and give them voice, and there was no champagne and no speeches and no press, only a sign in the window and the doors open on a Saturday afternoon in the first warm week of spring and whatever came of it. People came in off the street, drawn by the sound coming through the open door, And they stood and they listened, and I stood near the back, the way I had learned to stand in rooms where something important was happening, not directing it, only holding the space. And near the middle of the afternoon, a fiddle was brought out that I had marked in my notebook, one made of a walnut, so dark it was almost black. And a young woman set it under her chin and drew the bow, and the sound of it filled the hall, and I saw Silas across the room go still. He came and stood beside me. "I know that wood," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off it. "Years back a big walnut came down on my side of the fence in an ice storm, and Arnold asked could he have some of it. And I said, 'Take all you want, I have no use for a fallen tree.'" He was quiet for a moment, listening to the fiddle sing. "All these years I thought he just liked to stand at my fence and look out at the field," he said. "I thought he was only thinking. And I understood what he was hearing, that his own tree, the one he had given away for nothing, had been singing in a mill an hour off for years without his knowing that Arnold had stood at that fence not idly, but the way he stood everywhere, really looking, and had carried what he saw into the mill and made it into something that would outlast them both. He had been paying attention his whole life to Silas's field, and to that morning light, and to me, and he had simply never learned to say, 'Look at what I see.' He had only known how to make it, and seal it, and keep it, and wait for the right person to open the door. Near the end of the day, when the hall had mostly emptied and the light was going long and gold through the windows, I stood alone in front of the one instrument we had not strung, the unfinished cello, which I had brought and set on a stand in the center of the room, with no explanation and no card, because it needed neither. It stood there in its bare walnut, no varnish and no strings, the sentence my husband never finished, and it was the most honest thing in the room. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the small brass key, the one I had carried on my wrist for 3 months without knowing what had opened the one Silas had put into my hand in the gravel, the one that had opened the mill and started all of it. I turned it once in my fingers. Every door it guarded was open now. The mill was open. The box was open. The letter was read, and the wall was down, and the instruments were singing in a hall full of strangers who would go home and tell someone that they had heard something they could not forget. There was nothing left for the key to keep. I leaned down and set it on the windowsill beside the cello, gently without ceremony, the way you set down a thing you have carried a long way and no longer need to carry, and I stepped back and looked at the bare wood one more time, and then I turned and walked out into the spring light, and behind me, at last, after 44 years, my husband's quiet work was heard. I have thought a great deal since that spring about the difference between the secrets people keep to deceive you and the ones they keep because they never learned how to show you what was inside them. Arnold never lied to hurt me. He lied because somewhere long ago he decided that the truest part of himself was a thing to be hidden and protected rather than offered, and by the time he understood he was wrong about that, he had run out of the one thing none of us can make more of. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone in your own life who loved you in a language they never quite spoke out loud, take a moment and leave a comment and tell me about them, because I read them and because these stories are better when we tell them together. And if you want to sit with more stories like this one, stay a while. There are others waiting. Have you ever found something after a person was gone that changed the whole shape of who you thought they were? Something they kept not to deceive you, but because they never found the way to say it? Tell me. I would like to know I am not the only one who opened a door that late and found the person I loved on the other side of it waiting to finally be seen.